At home, I started developing film I had found in old cameras, and I saw that there was a world beyond ours. A world mostly forgotten, but not always on purpose. A world where memories fade into the shadows of the dark room. Things had been rough recently. At work, my boss had noticed that I'd been favoring one of my arms, and so he sent me home early, told me to stay home for the rest of the week, until I felt better. It was too bad because I needed the money, but even more than the money, I needed the exhaustion, and I needed the mental distraction. I had been having a hard time sleeping recently. After waking up multiple times, panicked and confused and in the darkness and not knowing where I was, I started taking some pills in order to help me sleep. But as the days went on, the pills started working less and less, and by Sunday I was shaky, in pain, and yet still exhausted in the way that drug-induced sleeps can leave you. Still, I tried, even late into Sunday, to get as much rest as I could, even though it just ended up with me laying in bed and staring blankly at the 1908 edition of Lear's Development Guide. Eventually, I decided to try to salvage what was left of the night, and so I reached over to the end table next to the bed and past the lamp and past the photograph I should have gotten rid of long ago. I set my alarm clock for work. Initially, I turned off the lamp, but every time I fell asleep, I would wake up a few minutes later, disoriented and afraid, with my heart pounding. After the second time, I decided I would be more comfortable sleeping with the lights on. The next thing I could remember was lurching forward in my bed, my heart beating erratically and heavily. My breathing was labored, and I was confused. The room was dark. Impossibly dark. I thought that I must have fallen asleep. It was so dark that I didn't even think my eyes were open. But soon they began to adjust, and I could see, faintly, only hints of the room. Like everything had been covered with a thick, black velvet sheet. Desperately, I reached out, stretching my arms as far as they could go, hoping to feel something, to gain a tactile sense of belonging. But nothing. No sensations at all. And then I felt it. The feeling of being watched. Crouched at the side of the bed was a man. Any details of his appearance were hidden by the darkness. He whispered to me, "Come with me. There is something I want to show you." And so we walked from the darkness of my room, down the stairs, and out onto the streets. The moon was bright. It was cold, and you could see the heat and the smoke drift up from the chimneys of the buildings lining the streets. My footsteps, the sound of my bare feet, seemed unnaturally loud in the empty night. suburban areas on the outside the city were almost identical. The moonlight was so pale that it rendered them all almost colorless, like they'd been painted shades of gray so subtle that only their owners could tell them apart. And the design of the houses was so similar, so uniform, that each home looked like a slight edit of the one before it. The lights were off in almost every one, but occasionally you could see that one had a dim light in a curtain-covered window. No one was out on the streets that night, but occasionally, out of the corner of my eye, I could see a shape, a shadow if there were anything at all, slip silently down a side street. But they always made sure to avoid the cold light of the street lamps. In a picture window, high up in one of the apartment buildings, a man was dancing. From where I was standing, on the cold and vacant sidewalk, I couldn't hear any music. Maybe there wasn't any. But still the man danced in that starkly lit room, the light catching the man and the furniture from the side and leaving them faintly outlined. The man turned just right for a second, and that light caught his face and wrapped around him, and you could see he was smiling. And then he turned, and the shadow wiped it all away. The suburbs turned into city, and the buildings became taller and more packed together, and we passed an old graveyard. There was a wrought iron fence surrounding the graveyard, but the iron gate, for whatever reason, had been left open. Without the streetlights, it was so dark inside the graveyard that the path quickly faded to nothing before I could get a look at any of the gravestones inside. Those graves were so old that any names they'd been marked with had no memories attached to them. Anyone who'd known them was long since dead. How long after I died would I be forgotten? Then the man spoke to me. Please, we must go. And so we walked, down past the graveyard and past the railroad tracks to the rocky edge of the ocean, where you could look down and see the waves push into the stone wall lining the coast. Or you could look out and see the islands of Casco Bay twinkling with the lights of houses that the people that lived there on those small slabs of land. For some reason, one of the lights on one of the specific islands kept drawing my eyes to it. And then the shadowy man stepped toward me. Do you see that? I didn't even have to look at him. Yeah, I said. I feel bad. I really do feel bad. It's a kind thing that I do. I know that they're sad. He handed me a photograph, an old Polaroid. A middle-aged man and a kid sitting in a boat, looking out over the ocean. It was probably from the 80s. Could have been anyone. I handed it back to him and I looked over the ocean at the island. From the edge of my vision, I thought I saw him do something with the photo. Maybe eat it. I don't know. Not on the island. The light blinked out. Is he dead? I asked. I know you're sad too. The streetlight cast shadows over the man, and you couldn't really make out his face. The shadows cast over his eyes made it seem like he had two large holes where his eyes should be, and from each of the eye holes there ran a small wet track where he'd been crying. And then the man took my hand and he led me back over the train tracks, and past the cemetery gate that had been left open, past the brick apartments that slowly became sparser and sparser until we passed the man in the window. And we walked back into my unlit room, where I lay down in bed, and the man reached over to turn my light on. I could see the man standing there in the darkness, reaching for the lamp, but then he stopped, hand outstretched in the air, a frozen shadow. And then he reached for something, a frame, a photo. Did I own something like that? And I don't know why, but I sat up and I went to stop him. And he turned on the light. And he was gone. Instantly, I was hit by a wave of exhaustion. My arm still hurt, just as bad as it did when I had first laid down. My copy of Lear's Darkroom Guide had fallen onto the floor, leaving my bedside table empty, except for the lamp and the alarm, which I knocked onto the floor trying to turn it off. Getting out of bed to pick up the fallen book and the clock, I was hit with the realization that it was already Monday, and I had a long work week ahead of me. And so I went over to my desk, and I took out some aspirin, some caffeine pills, and I drank a glass of water, dug my dirty work clothes out from my hamper. It was still cold outside, and the sun hadn't risen, but I just wanted to get out there and leave it all behind. Switch my mind off, like the lights in the dark room.